We all remember the old X and Y graphs from junior high or high school. And if it's any consolation, when I was in high school taking plane and solid geometry, I remember specifically thinking to myself, when the teacher said, "You will use this in your job, you better learn it and understand it," that I hated it so much that if I had a job that required me to use this, I would quit. So after I had been grading on the computer for 2 weeks, I realized that I was using an X and Y graph. But because it was applied to something, it was okay and it made sense. So we've got our X and Y graph. The way the Gerber system works is Y is straight up, positive is up, negative is down, pretty standard. X is the lengthwise grain, negative, positive. So the selvage runs the length of the X grain, and the cross grain is the Y grain. So when you see me working with patterns, you typically see me working with the pieces in this orientation, because this is the direction of the selvage and this is the cross grain, and I've marked it up here so hopefully you'll remember. And this would be 0 right here in the corner. So I'm making a t-shirt pattern, and I decided to start with that because they're simple and forgiving, and there's usually the same front and back, and the only difference is the neck area. The back is higher than the front. This one would be a pretty standard neckline on a women's t-shirt with a side seam that's curved. And we'll talk about the straight side seam, tubed ones, and decorative necklines. But we're going to input this in the computer as by measurements rather than by digitizing it. So when we're inputting it in the computer, our imaginary corner will be right here and it will be 0. And then we're going to be measuring in inches. So I've taken the time very carefully with this. You can see the pins if you look closely. I poked pins in the armhole so that the armholes on both the back and the front are lined up, and the front and back armhole are the same as each other. That's pretty standard in a t-shirt factory, because then they don't have to put any notches in the sleeve, and they can sew the notch in either the sleeve into either armhole. Because if you put notches in knits, sometimes they run. So they like to have as few notches in knitwear as possible. And that's why the sleeve is often the same. It's stretchy and it's reversible. So I've carefully pinned it together, and I've found the seams, and I've moved the stitching lines out, and I've pinned them together. Sometimes when a stack of fabric is cut out and it's multi-layers high, like you've seen in some of the other videos, the pieces on the top or the bottom of the stack will end up being twisted a little bit if the fabric moves. And so you won't get your left and right or front and back quite identically the same. So I like to pin all 4 sections together and take an average, because sometimes you'll find one side narrower than another. So now that it's all pinned together, I actually drew the line on the outside and slid the front of the t-shirt up against it, because I know that that has to be a straight line, and I wanted it to be straight while I was working with it. And then I just used my pencil and I traced around it and poked holes around the armhole. And if you look carefully at the sleeve, you can tell that the sleeve is actually slightly larger than the body. And that's normal for a woven shirt as well. Sometimes in a t-shirt, they might be identical. It's less important. But this one obviously has a little bit of ease in it. And so it hangs a little nicer. And I was going to go ahead and just let you watch other videos that people have done about t-shirts, because there's a lot of them. But I didn't like the way people talked about doing the sleeve, so make sure you stick around for the sleeve explanation part. Because the way I have it right now, I've forced the sleeve out of the way so that the body, the fabric, is laying exactly the way it would have been on the cut table when it was cut out. And the sleeve is pushed out of the way. And people often will just copy the sleeve in that position, and it doesn't work. You have to make sure that you move the body out of the way of the sleeve and have that grain aligned the way it was on the cut table too. So we'll come back to that. So I have outlined the shirt, and I want to make it a little bit longer. So I added about an inch. The hem is curving. They look better on the body if the hem curves slightly, because it would point downward, because this is an angle. If it was a straight line parallel to the center front, then you could have it straight, but because it's curved, it needs to be a 90-degree angle on the corner over here. So to put this in by measurement, we want to start with a box. So I've got the length of my shirt, and I want to define the sides of the box, because we're just going to make a rectangle piece. So I'm lining this part of the ruler up, and I'm finding the widest part, and that happens to be where the armhole is. And this purple square is going to be the outline of my box at first. So the size of my box is going to be, I could make it a little bit bigger, or I could keep it the same. Right now it's a little bit more than 9 3/4, and because I want to, I'm going to make this 10 inches. I could go ahead and use 9 3/4, but I want to make it 10. So my distance coming up here on my first line is 10 inches, and my length from the high point of shoulder is 22 3/4. And I want it a little longer, so I'm just going to go ahead and go with 23. So I'm going to label that it's 23 inches. And that will just mean my hem's a little bit longer. If you wanted to go with 22 3/4, you would just type in 22.75. So you can be precise with your shirt if you want to. Now, before I get too far, I've got the lines drawn on here, but you want to tidy them up and make it as nice and smooth as you can. For multiple reasons. It fits better, it hangs better, but it also is cut better if you've got nice smooth lines. So I'm going to make sure that it's all tidy. And I've already made a right angle at the bottom right here. Well, I could leave that alone where it is, or I could just go ahead and bump that out to the corner, and I think I'm going to go ahead and do that, because typically women in t-shirts like to have a little bit more width on the hips. So I'm going to go ahead and let that come out further, but you notice that I was careful about making sure we had a right angle in the corner. And I don't have to write all the numbers down, but I think it's going to make it easier for you to understand how to put it in the computer if I do. So our outline is 10 by 23. So that means that when the measurements are put on the spec sheet, it's going to be the high point of shoulder to hem that's the 23-inch number. and some of the other numbers aren't going to be reflected in the obvious box we're making. So right here, my measurement is also going to be 10 because I made it a little bit bigger. So that one's 10 inches, this one's 10 inches, they're touching. So that's just going to automatically come from the side of the box. But I still need to draw this line out here because I'm going to be measuring down from the top of the corner. So my distance coming this way is 8.5. And my distance coming from the imaginary line to the shoulder is 1.25 inches. And the narrowest part of my waist maybe should be a little bit lower, but I may end up changing that. Got a right angle right there, but I could rotate that sleeve if I wanted to, because, you know, that's a well-loved t-shirt. Usually when you pick out your favorite shirt, it is well-loved, and so it might be a little stretched out. So if I wanted to, I could move that over and change the shape of that armhole a little bit. But I would need to keep this a right angle, whether it was this line or this line. So these are decisions you get to make while you're making the pattern. But once you've got those decisions made, you want to identify where things are. So this one, measuring down from the top, is 14.25. And the measurement right here, the distance that this line comes up, is 3/8 of an inch, 0.375. So I'm going to need to make some lines for myself after I make the box to help me get to these guidelines. And this curve right here, if I were to bring this line all the way down and this line all the way up, that actually isn't 14.75. They actually cross over right there, and then I'm just going to blend that. So I'm going to change my mind right there. And that means that that distance is actually 14.5. That's bigger than 1/4. Okay, 14.5. So maybe I mismeasured before and you saw me do it, and I can't be right over the camera the way it's angled. Okay, so we've got 14.5, 8.5, 1.25, and I want to know how far out this point is. So that is 8.25 from this side. So my distance down, I'm going to move this back up to 14.5, and my distance to here is 8.25. So I'm giving myself all of the marks that I need to be able to make it in the computer, all of the numbers. So right here is the shallowest part of the armhole, and that one comes out six and 3/4, but I'm going to make the line pretty when I get to it. So And that 6 3/4 happens at 4 5/8. So right here, coming down is 4 5/8. So I'm going to need to put a point where those two intersect. This one is at 1 1/4, and that line where that corner is going to be right here, and that is 7 1/2 inches out. This one right here. The neck is 3 3/4. So we'll have a line right there at 3 3/4. I put it in the wrong place, and this neck drop in back is 1 inch, and the neck drop in front is 3 1/4. So a line at 3 1/4, a line at 3 3/4, and if you label them all in advance, then you can just sit at the screen with your paper, and it goes really fast. So that's how you make the body part of the t-shirt. 0, positive X, positive Y, and the reason you work with the pieces on the screen in this way is because ultimately you're going to put them on a marker and the selvage is going to be right there. Okay, here I've started the sleeve, and do you see how I've been really careful about folding the t-shirt itself out of the way, and if you got really close you could see the grain line of the knit, and not the cross grain so well, but well enough that I can tell that this is the shape the sleeve needs to be in. I don't want to allow the sleeve to go this way because that's not how it's going to fit. I want it to be exactly the way the grain was laying when it would have been cut. So that's where I've put it, and I've folded that out of the way, and I took a pin and I spread it out, and I poked pinholes all the way along here so that I could get the shape, and then I traced it off. And I put it in lightly, but I want to make sure the top of my sleeve is a right angle right there, or it won't be a smooth curve. And the bottom of this sleeve also is a right angle. So I'm starting with a right angle on both ends, and then this is where the underarm seam of the sleeve is. So from that area we've got a right angle here and here, and this is going to start out as a right angle on both ends of this line. So I'm going to line it up through where I can see and come back and make a right angle. Missed a little bit. And then come back down, and that's 1 inch long, so that makes sense. That's the kind of measurement you would get. And from there, I'm just going to blend it smooth with my curve and make sure that I stay within that right angle trajectory. And I'm going to give it my best guess right here, but I'm also going to apply my choices here to this one. So I've got the curve going one way, and then it starts to shift direction right there. And I like to give it as much space there as I can. And then I can adjust that a little bit. And I marked where the direction change happens because it will be easier for you to make that mark on the computer if you know that. So now I'm going to make a box around the outer edge of the sleeve, and I'm lining up so that I'm square with the line, and I'm going to make my box around all of the widest parts of the sleeve. And then I'm going to come back and line up with those square lines and find the outer edge of that corner. So there's the box that my sleeve comes in. And I've moved direction. This is my Y, and this is my X, because that's the way it will sit. It's not that way on the paper, and you can see the edge of the pattern, but I'm going to move this the other direction when I get it separated. Okay, so now I'm looking for landmarks, and at 7/8 of an inch up, I've got this mark, and a 1/2 inch down, 1/2 inch, 5/8 of an inch. So this is 7/8 this way, and 5/8, and then where this direction change is 3 3/4. Well, I'm going to go from the other side just because I want to be consistent. So 2.5 inches down, and 3 3/4 plus a little bit, going that way. And the width of my sleeve is 6 5/8, going that direction, and the height of my sleeve is 6 1/4, going that direction. And then this line is 5/8 of an inch away. This line is 7/8 of an inch up. This one's 2.5 inches down, and that one's 3 3/4 of an inch up. So, oh, and this wouldn't hurt. This one is 7/8 of an inch up from there, which really isn't the number I want. I want 1 3/4 from the edge of the paper. I mean, the square. 1 3/4. Okay, so that's all the information we need to input this t-shirt by measurement into the computer. And it's the thought process I want you to pick up. There's a lot of different ways of doing the same thing, but this is the shape that sleeves are supposed to be. Unless perhaps you're getting into dancewear. There's always an exception. While I'm at it, there's a few things that I want you to remember that will be on a quiz. In the computer, you'll look at the pieces, and at the end of every line where it turns a corner, there's an upward triangle, line end. And intermediate points are square. Intermediate. And then when you have an upward triangle and a downward triangle together, that is the graded end point. Of a line. And sometimes you'll see a downward triangle, which is just where a grade rule is. So memorize those for the quiz. Upward triangle, end point of a line. Square is an intermediate point. You have to turn those on. They aren't usually just there. Graded end point of a line is the combination of these two, and just the downward triangle is the grade point. This is another standard basic type of t-shirt, probably even more common than the other one. This is more of a men's shirt. The neckline is going to be higher. It's still probably going to have an inch neck drop. But what I'd like to show you is the side seam and the sleeve. There is no side seam in this. This was made from a tube knit, so there's no side seam. And then the armhole, the armpit does have a seam in it. So if we're looking at that the same way that we were looking at the other one, this line is going to be a straight line. And when you're copying, and we probably won't be working with a tube knit, so you'll have to put a seam there. And then when you're looking at the sleeve, this line is going to be much straighter and less curved. And because of that, when you copy the sleeve, it's also going to be much straighter. You won't have to push the t-shirt out of the way because this is a different shape of sleeve. So this sleeve would be shaped much differently than the other one, and that's a common shape. So a tube shirt is going to be cut that way, where the hems come together. They'll be flipped opposite, and the center front, the way it's going to be cut, is on one side and the center back is on the other. So the back neck would be here, the shoulder, the armhole, the shoulder, and then the front neck would be lower. And then they would just repeat back and forth all the way along the end. The other one will be going the other direction. And that way, they only have to cut that one shape. And every shirt, the size will change by having a larger tube shape. So this is where the side seam would be. The folds are usually down the center front. The two shirts where they come together on the end are going to have straight, and that's the shape that's going to be cut out so that your back neck and your front neck can be different. This is a picture where I've drawn a decorative neckline over the top of it. You can see the solid blue line is much more of a scoop neck than the original pencil one. And so to match that and have the curve match from the front neck into the back neck, the shape of the curve into the back neck, that dotted line will also be different, and we'll be talking about how to achieve that when you enter it online on the computer also.